I didn't live in her neighborhood. I didn't know her dues. And I sure as hell never signed a single HOA agreement. But that didn't stop Karen, the self-appointed queen of a nearby HOA, from slapping a lawsuit on me for violating neighborhood standards. The only problem? Her entire HOA was built on illegally annexed land, and I had the one piece of evidence that could bring the whole operation crumbling down. 3 minutes into the courtroom hearing, I handed the judge a single document, and just like that, Karen's empire collapsed in front of everyone. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the knock came, the kind of knock that doesn't ask for permission but announces itself like an authority figure, the kind of knock that brings paperwork, attitude, and usually a headache. I opened the gate and saw her standing there, short, tightly wound, with a pink visor, oversized sunglasses, and a clipboard that looked more like a weapon than an office tool. "Hello," she said with that sharp, nasal voice I'd heard echoing through the neighborhood at HOA meetings I never attended. "We need to discuss your violations." I blinked, more confused than anything else. Violations? I wasn't part of any HOA. That was part of the reason I bought the land 5 years ago, 5 acres of peace, technically outside the Elmridge Oaks community boundary, just past the creek that defined their official zoning. But here she was, marching up my drive like she owned the county. "You're putting up a fence," she snapped, pointing to the stack of cedar planks my contractor had dropped off the day before. "That style is not allowed. It must be uniform across the community." That's when I realized who I was dealing with. Karen Myers, president of the Elmridge Oaks HOA, self-declared community enforcement officer. I had heard stories, her obsession with lawn heights, the fines for non-standard mailboxes, the time she tried to ban solar panels because they didn't fit the visual consistency. I let out a half-laugh, stepped fully onto the porch, and said, "Ma'am, I don't live in your HOA. You've got the wrong guy." She bristled like I had slapped her. "That's incorrect. This parcel was brought under community authority last year during our boundary adjustment. All homes within the new extension fall under the same rules." I squinted. "Boundary adjustment?" She pulled a folded document from the clipboard like she was revealing a magic trick. It was a grainy black and white zoning map, one I recognized as the basic public assessor layout but with hand-drawn red marker lines scrawled over it, expanding the HOA's reach beyond what I knew to be legal limits. "You're mistaken," I said calmly. "I pulled my deed 2 months ago. This land's zoned rural residential. I've never signed any HOA agreement." Her lips tightened, and she tapped the paper with a manicured nail. "Doesn't matter. Annexation allows for regional inclusion. You don't have to agree." That's when the flag went up in my head. This wasn't just some annoying neighbor. She was trying to fabricate authority where she had none. "Is that your official HOA map?" I asked. She hesitated. "It's part of our expansion filing." "With the county?" I pressed. She didn't answer, only handed me a carbon copy of a violation notice, $150 for non-compliant fencing and a warning of escalating fines. Then she turned and walked away, not even waiting for me to respond. The notice wasn't even on official county letterhead, it was a template she'd printed herself, her HOA's logo in the corner, which, from a distance, looked almost governmental. I stared at the paper, then back at my land, my fence supplies, my permits, all legal, all above board. This woman was trying to bring me under her thumb without a single legal leg to stand on. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was a campaign. Later that evening, I drove over to the county zoning office and pulled the most recent boundary maps myself. My parcel was still clearly outside the HOA, just as I'd suspected. I even got a printout certified by the clerk, just in case. I was mad, sure, but I wanted to handle this right. The next day, I mailed Karen a certified letter with a copy of the official zoning map, my deed, and a warning of my own. If she or her HOA tried to enforce anything on my land again, I would pursue legal action. That should have ended it. It didn't. Instead, it escalated. Within a week, I got another notice, this time for vehicle violations, because I had a boat parked behind my garage. The same boat I'd parked there for 3 years, untouched, unbothered. I called the HOA office and was told, flatly, that I was on the enforcement list. I asked who added me. The voice on the other end hesitated. President Myers, they said quietly. She included your address in the Phase 3 inclusion. Phase 3? I'd never heard of any phase. I demanded the documents. They never arrived. Instead, WARN notices did. One for non-harmonious landscaping. One for outbuilding roof color. It was laughable, except it wasn't, because each one came with a threat of escalating fines, liens, and legal action. I started documenting everything. Photos, timestamps, envelope copies, recorded calls. I wasn't just dealing with a power-hungry neighbor. I was dealing with an HOA president who had crossed legal lines and was pretending she owned my land. I knew this kind of behavior. Pseudo-authority backed by forged or manipulated documents, scare tactics, and a lot of people just rolling over because they didn't know any better. But not me. I had time. I had resources. And I had a friend in the county recorder's office. By the end of the month, I would have something Karen didn't expect, proof. Not just that I was outside her HOA, but that she had no legal right to sue anyone outside of it. And that little map she kept waving around? It was about to be the fuse on a legal demolition. She had stepped on the wrong property. The moment I sent that certified letter with the official zoning maps and my deed, I expected silence, maybe an awkward retreat, a folded apology, or even just a passive-aggressive statement from the HOA office admitting the mix-up, but instead, what I got was war, a slow-burning siege from a woman who refused to acknowledge boundaries, legal, physical, or ethical, and who had made it her personal crusade to bring me under her HOA leash whether I liked it or not. The harassment started subtly, like a faucet drip at first, with random HOA volunteers walking past my property 4 times a day, people I'd never seen before, now subtly jogging along the road despite living half a mile away, all of them carrying clipboards or phones they kept angled suspiciously toward my home and truck, like they were collecting evidence of my nonconformity for some imaginary tribunal. Then came the flyers, folded into my mailbox even though that's a federal offense, and taped to my gate when I started locking the box warnings about mandatory community safety meetings, visual compliance audits, and garage storage violations that didn't even make sense for someone not living in their jurisdiction, and when I tore them down, more appeared within hours, this time in bright yellow paper with phrases like last notice and final warning underlined like ransom notes. I stayed calm, methodical, documenting everything with photos, saving every scrap of paper, every license plate I didn't recognize, even pulling footage from my driveway cameras which caught one of her so-called compliance monitors leaning halfway over my fence to take pictures of my backyard. And that was the day I filed my first police report, not because I thought it would solve anything, but because I wanted a legal paper trail, one that started with trespass and would soon escalate once I proved this wasn't just neighborhood pettiness but targeted intimidation by a private citizen acting under the illusion of legal power. I called the HOA office again, this time recording the conversation, and when I asked for a copy of the annexation documents that supposedly added my land to Elmer Joke's jurisdiction, I was placed on hold, then transferred, then disconnected 3 times, until finally a weary-sounding assistant admitted off the record that President Myers has a separate binder for the expansion plans that aren't county-filed yet, which confirmed exactly what I feared. Karen was playing lawmaker with a Sharpie and some forged meeting minutes, expanding her reach into property she had no right to touch, and nobody in the HOA had the spine to stand up to her. Later that week, I caught her on camera again, this time parked just outside my property in her silver Range Rover, staring through binoculars at my front porch like she was watching a drug house, and when I stepped outside, she actually ducked, then floored the gas and peeled off like a getaway driver, tires spinning mud across the roadside grass, leaving nothing but tire marks and the smell of burning ego. That night, I got a letter hand-delivered, not mailed, bearing the HOA letterhead, but this time it wasn't a violation notice. It was a formal notice of litigation, a cease and desist accusing me of willful non-compliance with recognized HOA standards and refusal to participate in civic governance, claiming I owed $6,400 in back dues, and that further refusal would result in civil remedies as outlined by Community Charter Section 14b. Which didn't apply to me because, I'll say it again, I wasn't in her damn HOA. I scanned it, cross-referenced every quote with actual county records and HOA charters, and found more than a dozen inaccuracies, including a boundary map marked with a community expansion plan that had never been approved, never filed, never even brought before the zoning board. And that's when it hit me, this wasn't just HOA overreach, this was fabricated authority, a fake expansion drafted in private and enforced through intimidation. Hoping most people wouldn't question the formatting of a legal-looking document, the next morning, I took everything to a land use attorney, a bulldog of a man who nearly spat coffee laughing when he saw her annexation map and said, "She's bluffing, you could break this in court in 5 minutes." But instead of charging into court immediately, we agreed to build a tighter case. Gather precedent, get public records of all official HOA filings, dig into Karen's leadership history, her election documents, her neighborhood board minutes, her email correspondence with the county, because if she'd faked one expansion, odds were she'd done it before. Meanwhile, I started hearing from neighbors, people on the edge of the HOA who were suddenly being fined for things they'd always done: backyard chickens, motion lights, driveway repairs done without approval, and when they pushed back, they were told they had been added to the compliance region, a phrase Karen had invented without a single shred of legal authority. They were scared, some paid, some folded, some just stopped answering their doors, but not me. I wasn't going to be the guy she steamrolled with a fake ordinance and a Photoshop certificate of compliance, so I pushed harder, filed more records requests, and what I uncovered next was even worse than I thought. Karen had submitted a proposal to the HOA board over a year ago to redefine the neighborhood footprint to include nearby parcels for aesthetic cohesion, claiming it would help boost property values and clean up the perimeters, and when the board denied it, she simply redrew the maps herself and began issuing citations anyway. No vote, no hearing, no approvals, just paper, tone, and threats. She had even filed lien threats against 2 other non-HOA residents, one of whom was a disabled veteran who didn't even have internet and thought the notices were real. My attorney's eyes nearly glowed when I showed him the evidence, because now we had something more than civil overreach. We had impersonation of authority, abuse of process, and possibly wire fraud if those documents were ever scanned and submitted electronically. And yet, Karen kept pushing, sending more letters, more fees due warnings, now claiming my fence obstructed communal due corridors. A concept that didn't exist in any code or covenant I could find. She was desperate, and I knew why. She'd spent so long pretending to be invincible, running her HOA like a personal kingdom, that the idea of anyone pushing back, especially someone she couldn't control, was throwing her into full-blown meltdown. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to burn her whole illegal scheme to the ground, brick by brick, document by document, in front of a judge who wouldn't be impressed by Karen's clipboard or her presidential tone. And when that day came, it wouldn't just be me walking away with a clear title and 0 dues, it would be her walking away in handcuffs, or at the very least, court-ordered humiliation. She had crossed the line, and I had the receipts. It was during a late-night coffee-fueled dive through county archives when I discovered the first real crack in Karen's carefully constructed illusion. A scanned, watermarked zoning map from 5 years ago that clearly marked the official HOA boundaries, and right beside it, a recent map she'd been circulating that included my property and several others not legally annexed, with no official authorization, no signatures, and absolutely no recorded amendments with the county clerk's office, which by law were required for any HOA boundary adjustment to become enforceable. This wasn't just overreach anymore, this was manipulation, and worse, deception intended to defraud landowners into compliance under false legal pretense. What tipped me off was a small detail, a red boundary line on her version that didn't match the GIS records from the county assessor. While her map was hand-annotated and copied like it had gone through 10 fax machines, the official version was crystal clear. I layered the 2 maps in a digital overlay and saw it plain as day. Karen had simply drawn a new line by hand, then scanned it into PDF format, printed it, and started enforcing it as if it was binding law. And because her targets, like me, were near the edge of the neighborhood, most didn't think to question it. Most people don't know what HOA boundaries look like. They see a letter with a stamp, a printed signature, maybe a logo, and assume it's real. But I had time, resources, and the one thing Karen underestimated, curiosity backed by legal muscle. My attorney took one look at the comparison and said, "This isn't just amateur. This is malicious." And he was right. We ran a records request for any HOA amendment filings over the past 3 years and got nothing, no county-acknowledged annexation request, no meeting minutes filed with zoning, not even a public notice in the paper, which was legally required before any boundary adjustment vote could be held. But Karen had done something else too. She convinced her own HOA board that the annexation had been quietly approved, relying on their trust and ignorance, passing around her homemade maps at meetings and citing county pending status to buy time. That lie worked on paper. It didn't work under legal scrutiny. At the same time, I spoke with a neighbor named Jeff, a quiet, retired civil engineer whose property was also targeted by Karen. He had received similar threats about his solar panels and water tank and had started doing some digging on his own. When I showed him the two maps, his face lit up. She did the same thing to my sister's neighborhood 2 towns over. Different name. Same tactics. I thought I recognized her. Turns out Karen had been involved in a similar HOA before Elmer Jokes, one that was quietly dissolved after multiple complaints of overreach, false fines, and questionable legal threats. It wasn't public record, but Jeff's sister kept every document, including letters signed by Karen under a different last name, Myers-Goldstein, and the handwriting matched the annotations on the fake maps. Now I had a pattern, a history, and motive. Karen wasn't just a bully. She was a repeat offender, someone who had built a persona of authority using forged jurisdiction and empty threats, playing the system because most people didn't have the time or money to fight her. But I wasn't most people. With every document we collected, my case built momentum. My lawyer contacted the HOA board directly, requesting a meeting to present discrepancies in Karen's map filings. They refused, deferring all communication to Karen. Typical. So we took a different route. We sent an official letter to every HOA resident whose property was marked in the disputed Phase 3 expansion, including a side-by-side map comparison, an explanation of their rights, and a line stating that no county documentation existed supporting their inclusion under HOA authority. The reaction was nuclear. Within 2 days, I got 12 phone calls from residents who had assumed their inclusion was legitimate, who had paid thousands in dues and fines for years without knowing the entire boundary was fake. They were furious not just at Karen, but at themselves for trusting the process. We told them, you have legal grounds for reimbursement. Civil court is on your side. Suddenly, Karen's perfect kingdom began to fracture. Board members started resigning. Residents began holding their own impromptu meetings. And Karen? She doubled down. She issued an official community correction bulletin claiming my documents were fake, that I was sowing dissent and impersonating legal authority, and even threatened to escalate to county legal departments for defamation. But it was too late. My attorney had already filed a cease and desist against her office, backed by notarized documents, land records, and witness testimony. We also submitted a fraud complaint to the state HOA Oversight Board. What came next flipped the entire story on its head. A clerk from the county planning office, someone who'd seen my request trail, called me personally and said, "You need to look at annexation case #17-043. It was denied. I pulled the file. It was the original application Karen had made to expand Elmer Jokes into the outer parcels, including mine, and it had been outright rejected due to lack of supporting votes, environmental impact concerns, and zoning conflict. Not only was it denied, but the county had sent a formal letter to the HOA stating the issue was closed. That letter was never mentioned by Karen. Instead, she kept pretending it was in process and pending. I finally had the smoking gun, a certified letter from the county, signed and dated, stating in no uncertain terms that the annexation was invalid and unenforceable. And yet she had acted on it anyway. Now the pieces all fit, the fake maps, the phantom meetings, the unpaid contractors who claimed Karen was funneling HOA funds into planning consultants, and the increasing number of residents calling for a board review. Karen's empire was built on fiction, and it was starting to collapse under the weight of truth. I met with my lawyer that week and said, "It's time. Let's go to court." He agreed. We drafted the lawsuit not just as a defense against Karen's bogus claims, but as a full-on countersuit for abuse of process, fraudulent representation, and attempted extortion. We were going to file it in the same district court where Karen had filed her nonsense claim against me, and when the judge saw the timeline and documentation, I knew it would be over in minutes. Karen had tried to build her legacy with a marker and a clipboard. I was going to erase it all with a single certified map and the law. It was early on a humid Wednesday when I received the official court summons, neatly tucked in a plain manila envelope delivered not by the postal service but hand-carried by a young man in a cheap suit who looked more nervous than I did. The document was Karen's move. Her official lawsuit against me, complete with her HOA's phony letterhead and a 20-page complaint riddled with fake citations, fabricated legal statutes, and accusations that I was in flagrant violation of HOA statutes under the revised Community Inclusion Guidelines, which, as both I and my attorney knew, didn't exist in any binding capacity. This wasn't just overreach anymore, it was outright legal theater, Karen using the court system not to seek justice but to intimidate me into submission, to scare me into paying made-up dues for an association I was never a member of, and to set a precedent for roping in other non-HOA properties she had no real claim over. The complaint listed me as a road property owner, accusing me of reckless architectural decisions, unauthorized landscaping changes, and non-compliant recreational vehicle storage, which in real terms translated to a fenced yard, a few fruit trees, and a canoe resting beside my shed, all of which were completely legal on my land, per rural zoning codes. The kicker? She demanded damages totaling $26,000 plus monthly HOA dues going back 3 years, with interest. I laughed out loud. It was bold and delusional, even, but I could see what she was doing. Karen was playing a dangerous game of legal chicken, assuming I'd back down to avoid costly litigation. But she didn't know I was already 10 steps ahead. I didn't just have a lawyer, I had a bulletproof countersuit, a binder filled with documents, time-stamped videos, audio recordings, and official county records proving not only that I was never in her HOA, but that she had knowingly lied about boundaries, distributed fake enforcement maps, and falsified HOA meeting records to justify her actions. We walked into that courtroom with quiet confidence. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense guy with a reputation for ending fake lawsuits before they began, slid our response across the judge's bench like he was handing over a royal flush. And when the judge scanned the first few pages, Karen's complaint followed by our side-by-side maps, county rejection letters, and my certified deed, the change in the room's energy was immediate. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table with 2 overpriced attorneys she probably paid for using HOA funds, already looking uncomfortable as the judge raised his brow and said, "This case is based on a zoning jurisdiction that was rejected by the county over a year ago." One of her lawyers stammered something about ongoing adjustments and community cohesion policies, but the judge wasn't having it. He flipped to our exhibits, tapped the page with a red stamp that read rejected, not approved, and looked directly at Karen. "Ms. Myers, is there any legal filing that supersedes this decision?" Her face flushed. "We were acting under pending interpretation," she muttered, and that's when my lawyer stood and politely corrected her. "Your Honor, not only was the annexation denied, but the HOA continued to distribute enforcement documents with knowingly false boundaries. This is not a zoning matter. This is fraud." The word hit the room like thunder. Karen froze. The judge leaned back in his chair, sighed, and turned toward the clerk. "We'll take a recess. Defendant's counterclaim will be reviewed in full. Plaintiff is instructed to prepare documentation on how enforcement decisions were made following annexation denial." That recess turned into a procedural delay that lasted 5 days, during which Karen's entire scheme began to publicly unravel. News of the lawsuit spread fast, thanks to a few vocal neighbors who had also received fake citations and were more than happy to tell their story to local reporters once they realized they weren't alone. A community Facebook group exploded with posts about Karen's map scheme, HOA harassment tactics, and photos of her Range Rover parked outside people's driveways with her binoculars out. The story was no longer about my fence, it was about power abuse, fake governance, and a woman who thought she could redraw laws with ink and ego. By the time we reconvened in court, Karen's board had already issued a public statement distancing themselves from her decisions, 3 members had resigned, and residents were demanding a special election to replace the entire leadership. None of that helped Karen when we filed our official countersuit, a civil claim for fraud, harassment, defamation, and abuse of process, backed by over 60 pages of evidence, signed affidavits from neighbors, and certified statements from the county recorder's office confirming the boundary rejection. Karen's lawyers tried to pivot, now calling it all a misunderstanding and requesting mediation, but the judge was having none of it. "This isn't a neighborly dispute," he said sternly. "This is a matter of someone fabricating jurisdiction and using it to extract funds and exert control over non-members. He then ordered a temporary injunction. Karen and her HOA were barred from issuing any further citations, collecting dues, or contacting me or any of the other non-HOA residents pending full investigation. I walked out of that courtroom not just relieved, but vindicated. I hadn't just defended myself, I'd exposed a system built on intimidation and fiction. Karen thought suing me would scare me. What she didn't know was that all I needed was 3 minutes, a certified county map, and a judge who knew the law better than she did. The real trial hadn't even begun, but the damage was already done, and her kingdom was cracking faster than she could paper over it. What came next would bury her entire operation, and the only thing left for her would be choosing how hard she wanted to fall. It was during the early preparation for our civil countersuit when the final nail in the coffin came into view, a hidden paper trail buried in county archives and buried even deeper in Karen's arrogance, one that would prove once and for all that she didn't just overstep her authority, she invented it. The revelation came from a quiet, unassuming assistant clerk at the county recorder's office named Dana, who, after seeing my name on repeated request forms, asked me if I had checked the abandoned file boxes from a zoning appeal that was never followed up on back in 2020. Curious, I followed her down a back hallway into a dusty archive room, where she handed me a thick folder labeled Elm Jokes HOA Boundary Amendment Proposal #13A. I sat down at a metal table, peeled the folder open, and there it was, a full legal request submitted by Karen Myers herself, requesting expansion of the HOA into 9 surrounding parcels, including mine, complete with doctored resident approval signatures, fake survey notes, and an attached letter from a community compliance officer who, I later discovered, didn't exist in any government records. But what hit hardest was the final page, a denial letter issued by the zoning committee, signed and sealed, dated 31 months prior. The rejection cited non-compliance with procedural standards, failure to notify affected landowners, lack of quorum during the HOA vote, and, most damning of all, a direct warning that any action taken to enforce regulations outside current jurisdiction may constitute fraudulent misrepresentation. That alone would have been enough, but the county included one more attachment, an internal memo from Karen, emailed to the HOA board, instructing them to move forward regardless with soft enforcement on the perimeter properties to normalize future inclusion. I copied everything. Scanned, emailed, notarized. When I showed it to my lawyer, he actually laughed and said, she signed her own indictment. That's when we restructured our countersuit to include intentional fraud, a charge that carried not just civil penalties but potential criminal consequences depending on how the court interpreted her use of fake documents to solicit payments. But it didn't stop there, oh no, because once I had that folder, the pieces fell into place like a jigsaw puzzle collapsing in reverse. We subpoenaed the HOA's internal meeting minutes and found multiple references to quiet annexation and boundary normalization, all language Karen used to suggest the expansion had been approved when it hadn't, tricking even her fellow board members into thinking it was legitimate. One board member, Alan Cruz, broke rank and sent us an affidavit stating Karen had told the board that all county approvals were already in place, and when someone asked to see the files, she said they were confidential until final phase. Alan's statement was gold. It was the first insider confirmation that even her own people were misled. Now the lawsuit wasn't just about me. It was growing into something bigger. Residents who had been paying dues under the fake expansion began contacting us, asking if they could join the suit. One elderly couple told us they paid nearly $12,000 over 3 years in fines, landscaping penalties, and parking violations, all while living on land never legally part of the HOA. We gathered 27 testimonies in a week. The numbers told a damning story. Karen had weaponized her clipboard empire to extract over $400,000 in fraudulent collections from people who had no legal obligation to her HOA at all. She had filed liens on properties, threatened court, sent letters styled to look like official government notices, and all of it hinged on a single lie that the expansion had been approved. It hadn't. And we had the proof. When our legal team sent a formal letter of intent to sue the Elm Jokes HOA, including a detailed breakdown of Karen's false filings, misused funds, and forged documents, we expected resistance. What we got instead was silence, followed by the quiet resignation of the entire board over a span of 72 hours. Karen, of course, didn't step down. She doubled down. She held a press conference on the HOA clubhouse lawn no less, where she called me a disgruntled outsider with a vendetta and claimed I was coordinating a cyber campaign to destabilize lawful community leadership. The video went viral in our town. People weren't laughing with her, they were laughing at her. And by the end of the week, the HOA's own legal representation resigned, citing a conflict of interest in client non-disclosure, which was legal speak for "we're not going down with this ship." Now the HOA had no board, no lawyer, and no legal authority to do anything. And yet Karen kept sending letters. She kept pushing notices through mailboxes. She even hired a private security company to start patrolling her zones, despite the fact that those very zones were never legally hers to begin with. That's when the sheriff's office stepped in. We handed over everything: maps, emails, the expansion denial, the fraud memo, the resident affidavits, the forged signatures, and a full criminal referral was made to the district attorney's office under penal code for impersonation of a legal entity and fraudulent collection of payments. Karen was served not a summons this time, but a search warrant. Investigators arrived at her house and the HOA office on the same day, seizing files, computers, hard drives, and financial records. I heard later that one of the agents said aloud, "This is one of the most blatant cases of HOA fraud I've ever seen." And I believed it. She hadn't just stretched the truth, she'd created an alternate reality and bullied hundreds of people into living inside it. But the spell had been broken. And as news outlets started picking up the story, the floodgates opened. Lawsuit after lawsuit was filed, some from homeowners, some from people like me who were never legally under her thumb but had suffered intimidation, financial loss, and public defamation. My case was no longer a defense, it was the template for every other victim to follow. I didn't just prove I wasn't part of her HOA. I proved her HOA was operating on stolen authority. And as the headlines blared, ***, local HOA faces collapse after fraud scandal, the woman who once bragged about bringing order to chaos now faced the very disorder she created, only this time with no boundaries to redraw, no false documents to hide behind, and no legal rope left to swing from. The day we walked into the courtroom for the hearing was nothing short of cinematic. Karen was already there, seated stiffly at the plaintiff's table with two visibly uncomfortable attorneys flanking her, while the audience gallery buzzed with reporters, community members, and more than a few residents who had once trembled under her HOA threats but now came to watch the spectacle unfold with barely concealed anticipation. I entered wearing a calm expression and holding a thick binder in one hand, the same one that now carried every piece of evidence, every certified document, every time-stamped letter and photograph that would not only dismantle Karen's lawsuit but expose the full depth of her fraudulent empire, built on ink, intimidation, and unchecked ego. As my attorney laid our countersuit on the judge's bench, there was a noticeable pause in the room. No one had expected a response this large, this coordinated, or this damaging. The judge, a seasoned man with a reputation for sniffing out nonsense, adjusted his glasses, flipped through a few pages, and turned to Karen's side with a single question. "Ms. Myers, are you aware that the boundary expansion proposal you submitted was rejected by the county zoning board in 2021? Karen stiffened but said, "There was no formal rejection. It was in process, awaiting reconsideration." The judge didn't even blink. He slid the stamped denial letter across the bench. "This," he asked flatly, tapping the page that bore a red seal and 3 signatures, including the zoning chair, with language that couldn't be clearer. "Amendment denied. No further action authorized." The room fell silent. Her attorney leaned over and whispered something urgently into her ear, but Karen shook her head and muttered, "We move forward based on reasonable assumptions." That was all the judge needed to hear. "So," he said slowly, "you move forward with enforcement actions, including the collection of dues, the filing of liens, and the issuance of violations, despite knowing full well that the governing body rejected your request." Karen opened her mouth but didn't speak. Her attorney tried to interject, but my lawyer was already on his feet. "Your Honor, in addition to that violation, we have 34 notarized affidavits from residents affected by those illegal actions, a financial report showing misappropriated HOA funds exceeding $400,000, and evidence that Mrs. Myers forged internal documents to manipulate her board into believing the expansion had been approved." The judge raised a brow. "All submitted to the court?" "Yes, Your Honor. As Exhibit A through D." He handed over a jump drive and hard copy binders, and I could feel the temperature in the room shift. Karen's shoulders sank, her face turned pale, and her fingers clutched the side of her chair like the ground beneath her was giving way. The judge didn't waste time. At this time, he declared, this court finds sufficient cause to issue an immediate injunction against Ms. Myers and the Elm Ridge Oaks HOA. All enforcement actions are hereby suspended, and the HOA's ability to collect fees or issue violations is frozen pending a full financial audit and further proceedings. You could hear the breath leave Karen's body like a balloon deflating in slow motion. The judge wasn't finished. Additionally, based on the preliminary evidence presented, the matter of criminal fraud will be referred to the District Attorney's Office for investigation. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel dropped like thunder. The room erupted not in applause, but in whispered awe, as though everyone present had just witnessed a tyrant dethroned without a single shot fired. Karen's attorneys gathered their papers in a flurry, trying to usher her out the side door, but reporters followed, neighbors called out, and someone from the back shouted, "Now pay me back!" Karen, while others simply filmed it all, capturing every second of her walk of shame. Outside the courthouse, news crews waited like vultures, and when I stepped onto the steps, microphones came flying toward me. "Sir, how did you take down the HOA? Did you know Karen personally? Are you going to sue for damages?" I said only this, the truth did all the work. I just kept receipts. From there, everything happened fast. Within a week, the HOA's bank accounts were frozen, residents were given formal notices that their dues would be suspended pending refund audits, and several county officials launched a full-scale review of how Karen managed to operate so long under false pretenses without detection. Behind the scenes, my attorney coordinated with a coalition of residents who were building a class action lawsuit, and guess who they wanted to lead it? Me. The guy Karen sued for planting a fence outside her fake borders. But I didn't do it for recognition. I did it to send a message. To her, and to every petty tyrant hiding behind fake authority, you may get away with it for a while, but all it takes is one person who knows the rules better than you, and it all comes crumbling down. Karen's world had depended on silence, fear, and forged paperwork. I came in with facts, law, and time. And in a matter of minutes, her fortress of lies was reduced to rubble. That courtroom firestorm didn't just clear my name, it exposed an entire web of fraud and turned her into a cautionary tale the whole county would never forget. The court ruling might have ended the case on paper, but in the real world, the fallout was just beginning, because the judge's injunction didn't just freeze the HOA's enforcement power, it set into motion a chain reaction that effectively dismantled the entire Elm Ridge Oaks HOA from the inside out, starting with a county-wide audit that exposed more financial irregularities than even we anticipated. The day after the courtroom firestorm, a team of forensic accountants appointed by the district attorney's office entered the HOA office armed with warrants and lockboxes, and within hours, they had uncovered unauthorized disbursements, undocumented vendor contracts, and over $87,000 in consulting fees paid to shell companies linked directly to Karen Myers herself. Suddenly, this wasn't just a civil fraud issue, it was a criminal enterprise masquerading as a homeowners association, and the state wasn't going to let it slide. The HOA board, what was left of it, scrambled to salvage credibility by hosting an emergency community meeting, which turned into an open mic shouting match with over 100 angry residents demanding answers, refunds, and resignations. I didn't speak, I didn't have to. The crowd took care of it for me. Videos of Karen trying to defend her actions went viral online, capturing her iconic breakdown when one resident waved the county's rejection letter in her face and shouted, "You lied to us for years." But it wasn't until the following Monday that the full weight of justice landed, when the county commissioner's office, in collaboration with the district attorney and the Department of Housing Regulation, issued an official order of dissolution for the Elm Ridge Oaks HOA, declaring it non-compliant with legal zoning, improperly constituted, and structurally fraudulent in its operation. That single document effectively shut the entire HOA down. No more dues, no more citations, no more patrols, no more Karen, and transferred all future governance responsibilities to the county while refund procedures were initiated through a supervised escrow account. The news hit like a lightning bolt. Local news outlets ran the headline, "HOA shut down by court order, fake annexation scheme exposed." I was flooded with phone calls, emails, and thank you messages from neighbors who had been too scared to speak before but now felt free for the first time in years. One man told me he'd been fined every spring for planting non-native flowers in his front yard, and now, for the first time in 15 years, he could finally grow what he wanted. Another woman cried on the phone as she explained how Karen threatened to foreclose on her property over a supposed fence infraction on land Karen never had any jurisdiction over to begin with. Each story reinforced the truth. Karen's HOA had ruled through fear, and now that fear was gone, replaced by a sense of empowerment and long overdue justice. As part of the shutdown, the court ordered a restitution fund to be established using what remained of the HOA's liquid assets, which were now under seizure. Karen's personal accounts were frozen too, and investigators were working overtime to trace every dollar she ever moved under the guise of community beautification. Meanwhile, the sheriff's department issued public warnings for any private security firm hired by the former HOA to vacate the area immediately, deeming their continued presence unauthorized and unlawful. At long last, the surveillance patrols disappeared, the mailboxes stopped receiving threats, and the ridiculous HOA newsletters, complete with Karen's monthly president's notes, ceased to exist. In place of fear came laughter, backyard parties, and neighbors shaking hands without worry. But Karen disappeared. Vanished from public view, her Range Rover gone, her home dark, her social media locked down. Rumors swirled. Some said she fled to her sister's cabin 2 states away. Others believed she was holed up somewhere lawyering up for the criminal trial now barreling her way. What we did know was this: the DA's office confirmed they had more than enough to proceed with charges of fraudulent representation, wire fraud, harassment, and misappropriation of funds. Charges that could carry real prison time, especially given the number of victims involved. When news of the shutdown spread to neighboring communities, it sparked something bigger, a county-wide review of HOA structures, compliance, and expansion procedures, all prompted by our case. Officials were calling it the Elm Ridge collapse, and other HOA leaders were now scrambling to check their maps, filings, and voting records, terrified of becoming the next Karen. Some even reached out to my lawyer for guidance on how to proactively audit their practices and avoid lawsuits. It was ironic. Karen tried to force me into her HOA, and instead, I helped dismantle hers and reformed a broken system in the process. By the end of the month, our class action suit was certified, with nearly 50 residents joining in, and the restitution process began slowly, painfully, but surely. People were getting back their stolen money. Others were simply grateful to never have to pay another made-up fee again. And me? I rebuilt my fence exactly how I wanted it, 6 feet tall, cedar wood with an iron gate, no approval needed. My land, my rules. I planted trees, built a new shed, and even bought another canoe. Not a soul bothered me. For the first time in years, my property felt like mine again. And when I looked up at the place where Karen once stood with her clipboard and empty authority, I smiled. Because the truth had done what it always does: it rose, it roared, and it wiped every lie off the map. Elm Ridge HOA was gone. Karen's empire was reduced to rubble. And the peace that followed? That was the real victory. The final chapter of this long, strange saga didn't take place in a courtroom or a county office. It happened, fittingly, on the very sidewalk Karen once claimed was her jurisdiction, during what should have been a quiet Saturday morning that turned into a viral meltdown seen by half the county in less than 24 hours. By that point, the Elm Ridge HOA was officially disbanded. The restitution fund was in full swing. The sheriff's department had warned Karen to cease all contact with residents, and multiple felony charges were being prepared by the district attorney's office. But Karen, ever the control addict, couldn't let go. She reappeared unannounced, emerging from whatever hole she had crawled into, wearing her trademark pink visor and blazer, as if she could step right back into power with the force of her voice alone. It started with her marching up to a neighbor's property, an elderly couple named the Hendersons, who were repainting their front porch in a beautiful sky blue tone that Karen once fined them for. With a shaky iPhone camera recording, she screamed at them about visual continuity violations and shouted that some standards never change, waving a ratty old clipboard like a badge of authority. The Hendersons ignored her. Their granddaughter, filming from the driveway, simply said, "You don't work here anymore, Karen," which caused Karen to explode. She snatched a paint roller, threw it into the grass, and screamed at the top of her lungs, "I built this community." That was her breaking point. Residents began gathering outside, filming, laughing, some shouting back sarcastically, "Not anymore, you didn't." Didn't the judge fire you? Is this trespassing or just pathetic? Karen spun around, red-faced, eyes wild, and screamed at everyone to stop filming. But it was too late. Her voice cracked. Her legs trembled. And finally, with all cameras pointed at her, she screamed, "I'll sue all of you," and kicked over a potted plant before storming off the porch in tears. That was the moment the world saw the truth, not the powerful HOA queen she once portrayed, but a bitter, broken fraud who had built a kingdom out of fear and now couldn't stand on her own without it. Within hours, the video was online, uploaded by 3 different people under the title "Karen's Last Stand, HOA Queen Loses It After Legal Shutdown," and it went viral almost instantly. Thousands of views, hundreds of comments, many from other towns where HOA abuse had reared its head. People began sharing their own stories, tagging housing watchdog groups, and calling for HOA reform across the state. Karen didn't show her face again after that. Officially, she was still awaiting her pretrial hearing for fraud, but her attorney quietly negotiated a plea deal behind the scenes: restitution payments, probation, permanent disbarment from any future HOA involvement, and a public letter of apology to every resident she defrauded. The court accepted. She avoided prison but paid dearly in every other way: her finances wrecked, her reputation destroyed, and her name now synonymous with HOA tyranny in every neighborhood Facebook group within a 100-mile radius. As for me, I returned to my peaceful life, only now with more friends, more community support, and more clarity about what happens when the right person stands up to the wrong system. I was asked to speak at a town forum on HOA transparency, where I told the crowd, all it took to shut it down was a map, a judge, and the truth. And someone who refused to be bullied. Applause followed, not for me personally, but for what it represented, the idea that we weren't powerless. That authority is only as real as its foundation. And when that foundation is built on fraud, it takes just one crack to bring it all down. In the weeks that followed, I watched as neighbors planted what they wanted, painted their homes in colors they loved, fixed driveways without permits, and started living again, not under fear, not under surveillance, but under their own free will. Karen's old signage was taken down, her patrols gone, her newsletters used for kindling at block parties. The clubhouse, once a monument to her rule, became a community center run by volunteers, open to everyone, no dues required. Freedom didn't feel chaotic, it felt earned. And as for me, I sat on my porch one evening, sipping iced tea under the new fence I built myself, listening to the laughter of kids playing down the road, and I realized something: Karen had tried to force me into her HOA, but instead, she handed me a purpose, one I never asked for but didn't regret. Because sometimes, the greatest victories come not from what you gain, but from what you protect. I didn't just save my land. I helped free an entire neighborhood. And every time I look out over my property line, I don't see a border anymore. I see a line that held. One that she tried to cross and failed.